Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a look at campus radicals when I put Stuart Hagmann's The Strawberry Statement up against John Singleton's Higher Learning. And this was another one that was a hard decision because both these movies are great in their own way. So let's just dive right into the first one. Stuart Hagmann's The Strawberry Statement, starring Bruce Davison, who is best known for playing the Senator in those X-Men movies and the original Willard. Here he's in college and he's, on the rowing team, and at first, the dude seems like the typical jock, everything is like a joke to him, but he's surrounded by a lot of radical shit going on. There's protests, demonstrations, and, you can tell just even by like his apartment, just how skewed his ideology is. But what this movie stands the strongest on is something I've never really seen in other movies. Some they touch on it, but just to really drive the point home, the only reason why anybody gets into radical politics is because of one thing, and that's pussy. And and especially when you're in college, and the Bruce Davison character is no exception to this rule. He's clearly fascinated by all the shit that's going on, and he's definitely, and when one of his fellow rowing members confronts him, calling him a liberal commie, he's like, well, I'm a liberal. And he's like, well, you're a commie too. In his mind, they're two completely different things. They're not, with Bruce Davison, he's very moderate, but he can understand, there's a lot of shit that's wrong that needs to change and all this shit. So he starts getting into like the sit-in thing that's going in the president's building, because and at the base of it, like the biggest thing that they're protesting in this movie is the fact that the campus takes away a park from the neighborhood, which are a lot of black children play. And so this is like the perfect pet project for a bunch of entitled white people in college. And they're going to build it they're going to use it to build an ROTC building, which, of course, against the war, Vietnam was still going on at this time, even the time the movie takes place and the time the movie was made. This was one of those string of those movies about campus radicals in 1970 that, was still trying to be fresh when, from the era of 68 to 72, the climate changed so quick, even one of the radical groups was called the Weathermen. So, and then, later changed to the Weather People because, name changes are really fucking important when you're trying to have a revolution and shit. Branding is important here. But what's cool about the Strawberry Statement is it's also done in a way that's very European in style. This was nothing new for any film made, especially in the late 60s and early 70s. We're still fresh on all the wave of European films and even some of the Swedish films like Ingmar Bergman's shit and stuff, but all the weird quick cuts and everything. It's really putting you inside the mind of Bruce Davison and all the shit that he's going through. And of course he becomes smitten with the lovely Kim Darby, who's, she's all for women's liberation, but she'll go on. It's just a weird kind of thing where she's all for women's liberation, but also she wants the whole monogamy thing and all that shit. But he's still trying to court her. There's some very beautiful scenes, but in between all the campus protests and demonstrations, they're able to go on cute little dates and shit, set to a really good soundtrack, definitely of the times that this movie takes place, which is clearly the school year of 69 to 70. And, a lot of Neil Young, a lot of all that fucking hippie radical shit that was yeah, we're going to change shit and stuff. And, it really comes down to the ending of this film that is it's one of those adjacent to those art house freeze frame endings, but it's done so in a masterful way. It doesn't cop out like something like The Day of the Locust did when you're going to do something just so horrendous and, because, everybody knows that they're going to get busted, so they're just waiting to get busted by the cops, and boy, do they get busted. Motherfuckers go in there with tear gas canisters and they're tear gas guns and just shooting that fucking shit. And, motherfucker, they're beating the fuck out of these motherfuckers. And so it's almost kind of romantic, the fact that, Bruce Davison and Kim Darby are they're both getting the crap beat out of them by the police. And, he jumps forward and then that fucking song, Buffy Marie Saint, whatever the fuck, who sings that shit round and round in the circle game, starts playing. And it's the same song that opens the movie and it kind of ties it all together as this dude came to college to learn, gets wrapped up in all these radical politics and shit, and then just like, what is it all for? There is no hope. It's bleak as fuck, because even by this time in America, and especially on campuses, it's like they're still like, doing their best to like really, push forward that revolution, but the revolution never fucking came. It died with, consumerism and all that shit, and all the other disappointments of the 70s. And then we kind of move forward to John Singleton's Higher Learning, which finds us in college in the 90s. The mid 90s movie was made in 95. So it's set to reflect, the early 90s college atmosphere. And there's a lot of shit, the 60s were basically for naught at this point when you see all the shit and how divided everybody's kind of, it's almost like, prison, the way everybody's in their own little clique, or high school, also high school, prison, not too much different from each other, a few obvious similarity or a few obvious differences, but there's still a few obvious similarities. But even here, it's like nothing really changes. Everybody's with their own, as the character Michael Rappaport says, everybody's kind of with their own. I thought college was bringing us together, all this fucking shit. And he himself is probably the most tragic figure in the film, and made so much so very heavy-handed. But he's kind of the out of place, hick white boy that doesn't really fit in with anybody, and then finally gets seduced by these skinheads that's led by Cole Hauser, who gives a brilliant performance. Is that, that everybody in this movie is very believable in the parts that they play. We got Ice Cube and Busta Rhymes that are they're fucking great when they are on the screen and shit. And then Christy Swanson, of course, most famous for playing Buffy the Vampire Slayer in the movie. And she ends up, the movie deals with a lot of hard subjects, because that her character gets raped by a guy while she's drunk, and then she has to deal with that. Also, she may or may not be getting seduced by a lesbian played by Jennifer Connelly, who introduces her to this, feminism group and shit. And Omar Epps, who's a track star in the film, he's having to deal with a lot of like warring ideologies, because he's got the professor played by Lawrence Fishburne. I don't know exactly what fucking accent he's doing, but I in a way it kind of takes away from the seriousness of what he's trying to say. And it's like not negating, the Lawrence Fishburne's acting chops. Dude's one of the greats. But there are times, especially when he's in shit like this, where he just kind of, he knows what purpose he serves. They couldn't get Morgan Freeman, so they settled for Lawrence Fishburne, somebody to tell you how you should feel, and to reiterate the point every 30 minutes in case you haven't like realized what the fuck they're talking about in the movie. And of course he's kind of discouraged because he's weeping for the future, because these kids don't know shit. They're so wrapped up in their own bullshit. They want to whine about whatever station in their life, whether I'm a woman, I'm black, or I'm white. Nobody likes me because I'm white, whining about that shit. Fucking skinheads and shit. So Michael Rappaport gets seduced into all that shit, and then he ends up shooting up a peace rally that's been orchestrated by the Christy Swanson character, because she's like, can't we all just get along type shit, And, much like the Strawberry Statement, it does a really good job of pointing out the hypocrisies of liberals, especially liberal white people. When everybody gets to college, they just become fucking annoying, because you read books, you find out shit that nobody wanted to tell you because nobody wanted to talk about it type shit. And then you become all radicalized because you're enlightened and shit. And, there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of layers to Higher Learning that they address more shit than Strawberry Statement does. But Higher Learning kind of just, much of the same issues with Boys in the Hood, where it almost feels like an after school special. Like there's really nothing as shocking as that fucking ending of Strawberry Statement, where like, yeah, at any time you see like a mass shoot, well, it really wasn't even a mass shoot, like 3 people died, but and honestly, even that dude, Michael Rappaport's character that shoots up, like his final confrontation with the cops, where he's like all of a sudden, whining, like, I didn't really want to do all that victim of circumstance bullshit. Honestly, it would have been way more shocking if that dude just would have been defiant to the end and just killed himself, but that's what makes him so tragic, because, the weak-minded are lured into this bullshit, and, and it's just everything. And the movie itself, very well written, very well acted, but, at the end of the day, like, when it comes to movies, I don't really need a lecture. I want the images to speak for themselves. Let me figure out how I should feel about it, because there's very like poignant moments, especially at the beginning of Higher Learning, where Christy Swanson and Omar Epps' characters are in the elevator together, and she gets all weird. She starts holding her purse and all this shit. Just as she's a black man in the elevator. But ironically enough, it was one of them preppy ass white boys that raped her ass. So, it really is good at pointing out the hypocrisies, but I honestly think Strawberry Statement does it better because they don't fucking hit you over the head with a sledgehammer. And there's a really great scene in the Strawberry Statement that fully points out the hypocrisies of white people, especially the white liberals. Kim Darby and Bruce Davison are in the park, and there's a group of like brown and black, like I guess what's led to believe like they're gangsters that get ready to hold them up and shit, and they're all like freaking out and like and then they have when nothing really happens, dude smashes his camera, probably because like y'all are the ones fucking in the park. There's like kids just over there, but like you're freaked out because these motherfuckers roll up on you and don't even really say shit to you. They just kind of look like, really, but it's fucking crazy. And then they leave, but then they fucking Bruce Davison's bitching about, we're supposed to be helping, nobody cares and shit. So it's like, and then just that moment of reality when the cops are whooping your ass at the end, so this round has to go to the Strawberry Statement because like that the movie is a lot more powerful, and I feel like there's a lot of shit in Higher Learning that could have been done a little bit better to make it more powerful, because like I said, there are a lot of layers. John Singleton, one of the greatest writers and directors of all time, because he's able to get like really good performances from actors that would otherwise be mid in the hands of a lesser director and stuff. But I still think the 70s do it better when it comes to tackling the hard subjects. So for anybody keeping score this round, it goes to the 70s. That's 29-26. 70s are up by 3 again. These last couple rounds really surprised me, but that's just the power of 70s cinema. They really didn't give a fuck, and they were really good at pointing out the hypocrisies, because when you've had that shit shoveled down your throat, it's a lot different than when you see the motherfuckers that have been entitled for most of their lives, and it's like, oh, you just read a book, or you felt enlightened by this, and then you decide to take a stand on it, or whine and all that fucking shit. So yet again, if I've said anything wrong, anything you disagree with, or anything you think I like should expound upon, like I said, I try to only make these less, below 15 minutes, because like who the fuck wants to hear me talk for fucking ever? And on top of that, this one and many other ones that I've done, there's so many other things you could talk about with these subjects. But at the end of the day, the point is, which one is the better movie? And I think Strawberry Statement is the better movie, because it does feel more like a movie instead of some shit that I should be watching in a little after school special and shit. But this shit is heating up. Like I said, rough draft to a doctoral thesis. So if anybody has any comments, it can only get better. It can't really get worse.